Hello, welcome everyone to this second in the International Free Expression Project's series of online conversations with visionaries who have defended your right and my right to speak our minds. Many have done so at great personal risk, including our guest today, the brave and brilliant Dr. Stella Nyanzi. I'm Greg Victor, the founder and CEO of the International Free Expression Project, and we're honored today to present this forum with Dr. Nyanzi. First, a quick word about the Free Expression Project. We hope to build a world in which everyone can be who they are and say what they want and be heard. And to that end, we leverage the work of allied organizations and our own initiatives to raise awareness and move people to action. Our four core initiatives are, first, to build a home for free expression, a marketplace of ideas. Our marketplace of ideas in an abandoned press room where two historic newspapers were published for nearly a century. This unique venue is located at the scenic confluence of three rivers in the US city of Pittsburgh. Second, we want to build the world's first iconic work of public art symbolizing free expression, maybe something as exciting as Chicago's Cloud Gate. Third, we're creating new high-tech educational tools that drive home the importance of free expression. And fourth, we're supporting artists by commissioning and exhibiting their work. You can learn more at our website, ifep.io. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Karamaji Rajumba, who will lead the conversation with Dr. Nyanzi. Karamaji Rujumba was born in Nairobi and raised in Uganda. He immigrated to the United States in the 1990s, earned a bachelor's degree at Wittenberg University, and then a master's degree in journalism at Columbia University. Karamaji next became a reporter for The Blade in Toledo, Ohio, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, for which he often wrote insightful and powerful stories based on his reporting in Africa. Karamaji now serves as Communications and Development Director for the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation. Dr. Stella Nyanzi is a Ugandan human rights advocate, poet, medical anthropologist, feminist, queer rights advocate, and scholar of sexuality, family planning, and public health. The international press has called her one of Africa's most prominent gender rights activists, a leading scholar in the emerging field of African queer studies, and a leader in the fight against repressive anti-queer laws and for freedom of speech. Dr. Nyanzi earned a PhD in anthropology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and went on to teach at Makerere University in Uganda. While there, her office was shut down when she declined to lecture in a new PhD program. In response, she employed the West African feminist practice of naked agency and protested in the nude against her boss. A short time later, Dr. Nyanzi was arrested for insulting the president of Uganda. She had referred to him as a pair of buttocks and was suspended from her university. She was subsequently dismissed and soon sent to prison by the government, where she spent almost 16 months. Dr. Nyanzi is a well-respected scholar, too. Among her most cited articles are those on Ugandan youth sexual relationships, Ugandan women's control over sexual encounters, and Ugandan men's attitudes toward contraceptive use. She is one of the first scholars to publish research on African homosexuality. Dr. Nyanzi is also one of the prominent free speech activists celebrated in the IFEX Faces of Free Expression project. IFEX is the global network of more than 100 free expression organizations and was our partner in mounting an outdoor art installation featuring the faces of free expression at the front entrance to Pittsburgh. The online presentation of this exhibit can still be experienced on our website, ifep.io. And now, please welcome Dr. Stella Nyanzi and Karamaji Rujumba.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to extend our welcome to you all. I think we have people here engaged pretty much from just about around the world. Here in Pittsburgh, it's just about noon, a little past noon. In Kampala, it's 7 p.m. We have people on the West Coast. We have people joining us from the United Kingdom. So it's really a global discussion about free expression and the aspects of free expression. And in many ways, there's no better person to have that discussion with than Dr. Nyanzi because of her track record as somebody who is definitely a fierce advocate for free speech and who has shown in word and deed that free speech is important to an open and pluralistic society. It's a pleasure talking to you, first of all, Dr. Nyanzi. I've followed your works for quite a while, and I'm quite excited to have this opportunity. Not a lot of people like me that have followed your work and read a lot about your work and know what you're doing. Could you just start by an introduction about yourself? Tell us about yourself, your background, your academic interests, what led you into your academic interests, and what it is that drove you to be who you are and what you're doing now.
Wonderful, wonderful evening where I am. Good day if you're wherever else in the world. Good morning, good night. I want to thank very much Greg of International Free Expression Project and Karamagi for this opportunity to talk about freedom of expression. Although, as I tweeted, I live in a very repressive society that penalizes free speech, especially those of us who are critical of the government. And so when you introduce me as an academic, I think it's interesting because one of the places one would imagine there's autonomy and free speech is the space where academic freedom should be protected. However, in countries such as mine, even academics are silenced, and even especially when they're critical, when we are critical, we have to silence ourselves, otherwise it's dangerous. Our research grants will be taken away. One might be deported or demoted. If one is in my situation and they are critical of the government, they can be threatened, intimidated, receive death threats, but also actually be suspended from their work. My first suspension was in regards to the protest where I undressed. I staged a naked protest at the university, another mode of free expression, if I may. And while it was perhaps really scandalous, it raised an awareness. It told the silence and the invisibility around the violations of the labor rights of academics. And it brought to the fore issues at Makerere University, the oldest public university, of a lack of autonomy and independence of particularly younger Black women researchers, right? But yes, to introduce myself, I think what I want to say is that part of what excites my work and my knowledge production is the ability to use whatever little relative privilege I have to speak truth audaciously to power. A refusal to be silent in the face of injustice. And I think that a lot of the diplomatic, civil, respectable modes of communication are no longer listened to or heard by those that hold power in repressive regimes such as Uganda. And so what happens is that one then has to devise creative means of speaking truth to power, right? And I think that for me, the creative arts, poetry, short stories, metaphors that may be really painful or shameful, or deploy genitalia and other body parts that one never brings out in public because they're private or assumed to be, to throw them in the public, and in order to highlight an issue that everybody is refusing to see, an issue that's out there, an issue of violation, is important to my work. So I think everything that I've done is kind of using my relative advantage, if it's voice or the ability to write or access to internet, to shed light on a particular issue of oppression, violation that takes away freedoms from people. That's kind of who I am. I'm just a voice that does things in creative ways, whether it's throwing my middle finger at the High Court judge, or undressing and throwing off my bra while I'm in a prison, an all-men prison surrounded by male prison guards and receiving a sentence, or whether it's sitting in the High Court judge's chair when she's late, or whether it's, carrying a placard with a slogan that says blowjobs are jobs, sex work is work. These are creative ways of freely expressing myself that I think I'm excited to use come what may, whatever the consequences are. So that's who I am briefly. I'm a mother, and so the future is very important to me. A lot of what I do, I would not have done if I didn't have children, because I think if it's too late for my generation, for my world, it shouldn't be too late for my children. So maybe we'll salvage something for the future generation.
One of the things I would like really to bring out in this discussion, I know you're a social and political activist, you're also a politician, but I'm more interested less about, we'll touch about the political aspect, but more in what drives you, what motivates you. And going a little bit back to my initial question, was it your academic interest in public health, in gender rights, in sex behaviors of teenagers that brought you into a sphere of activism? Or how did you graduate to that? Because there's an academic interest you have where you started and metamorphosed into essentially a cross-cultural activist, forgetting the specific areas. I've seen a lot of descriptions of you as a gender rights advocate, as a women rights advocate, but you also advocate for labor. You also advocate for young mothers. You advocate for free speech. You advocate for a lot of things. So my interest is, how did you get there? Was it something in the work that you were doing before, or was it some particular kind of inequity in society that you noticed that you saw there's some kind of, space for you to go into?
Right. I know you said you don't want us to talk about politics, but I want to say that everything is political. If one lived in my part of the world, just being a woman is political. Having access to a vaccine is a political question. Having access to food even, right? Voice is political. What one says and what does not get said. Who says it? All those are political questions. My focus in the academy was really of a naive young woman who was interested in publishing in order to get promotion as an academic. Because of the relative social status of my father as a medical doctor and my mother as a social worker, I was protected a lot, for example, from what poor people in Uganda have to undergo through public hospitals, the public healthcare system. However, I think that my initial interest in studying health and illness was when HIV/AIDS were just coming to Uganda. My father had a clinic, and there were so many sick bodies coming into my father's clinic, unable to pay for their medical care, and they would die. And I think part of what really puzzled me as a young child was the rhetoric around sex and how bad sex would lead to death. Unprotected sex would lead to death because there were no ARVs. In that time, condoms were still a scandalous taboo subject, only to be used by poor sex workers and people with illnesses such as gonorrhea and syphilis. And I think I was really interested in the rhetoric around good sex will let you live, and the good sex was very moral, a man and wife having protected sex and having children, and that was the sort of sex that was promoted publicly. And I was interested particularly in my uncle's death. My uncle had 54 children at the time of his death. He had over 8 known wives. Polygamy in our context is normal, as Karamagi might attest. And he wasn't an ignorant, man. His brother, my father, was a medical doctor. Part of my interest was that all the sex with his 8 wives that produced 54 children that my uncle had was good sex, according to the books. And so that disjuncture between good sex and its fruits and bad sex that would lead to death became my entry point into wanting to understand medical cultural discourses. And so my entry into medical anthropology was via HIV/AIDS. And the lack of talk about pleasure, the lack of rights of people who are getting infected in the absence of antiretroviral therapies really drew me into that area. But much more importantly, poor people and poverty, and how policies were not speaking through. A lot of my early work was blind to the diversity of sexualities and sexual orientations, which was very heterosexist. And although I published a lot, I was blind to the fact that there were other modes of being sexual. So I think at the time of my PhD, so I've now moved way past the 80s. At the time of my PhD, I was living in the Gambia, and the president of the Gambia threatened to behead all homosexuals. He gave them, I think, 24 hours to leave the country. And I was thinking, what about homosexual Gambian men? What is going to happen to them? And so the silencing by presidential decree of a sexual orientation of a group of men who were sort of MSM, the men who have sex with men category, become really interesting to me, because the government in Gambia denied health services and health products and antiretroviral therapies and DCT, or voluntary counseling and testing, to homosexual men. And yet we knew that at the time there was a higher levels of infection among men who had sex with men in Gambia. And so that is my point of entry into interest in studying sexual minorities. A little while later, I came to Uganda and we had the anti-homosexuality bill. And I think for me that my progression from the medical anthropology of sex to the legal anthropology of sex and sexual minorities is at that interface of presidential decrees, but also the laws such as the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda that wanted or had proposed to heal people who are reported to be homosexual having same-sex affairs. So I think my interest and all my knowledge production as an academic researcher has been at that interface of powerlessness. When power holders deny powerless people access to public services, public health, public shelter, public education, even if it's medical education, I think for me, the injustices therein were what took me much more into activism based on my academic work. Now, a lot of my earlier activism was really abstract and academic. It did not involve me. My father, as a medical doctor, had access to all the private healthcare that I needed. And then he died. He died like a pig, looking around for one vial of medicine. One night he got a heart attack. He knew the medicine he wanted. He knew his prescription. He knew the diagnosis that if he did not get a single vial of medicine, right, he was going to die in about six hours or so. And so he moved from the village where he had retired after 45 years of working in hospital. He moved from the village and went to the village clinic, and the village public clinic did not have medicine. It didn't have that vial because the pharmacological laws do not allow particular medicines to be kept in the homes of doctors. He moved from the public clinic, a health center 3 level, went to a hospital, health center 4, and went to Masaka National Referral Hospital, driving in the night. His brother was driving him. And all these health centers that are supposed to be provided for by the government of Uganda did not have this single vial of medicine. As my father was driven into the National Referral Hospital, he died. Okay? And the violation of what poor people in Uganda go through looking for medicine hit me hard. It hit me so hard. And I thought, oh my God, I've been speaking about these issues because they concerned others, and I lacked a passion because those were not my issues, they were poor people issues. To aggravate my sense of injustice, 1 year later, just after my father's memorial service, my mother dropped. And in an hour of waiting for an ambulance to pick her from the floor where she was, because all her children had gone back to the city, my mother collapsed. I mean, she passed out, waiting for an ambulance to take her to hospital. The hospital is about 5 minutes away from our home. Now, I think for me, my grief in that moment was about losing a father, a medical doctor looking for a drug, and losing a mother, a social worker who transported so many people, so many patients to hospitals and clinics, losing her as she waited for an ambulance, as I called from one public health facility to another, to private ambulances to come and pick her from home. So part of my sense of injustice is now very personal, because one doesn't have to be poor to suffer the insufficiencies of a public health care system that does not work. So that is when my activism takes on this ferocious, very personal, intentional tenor, which some people don't understand. Perhaps I think if I had raised my voice a bit louder, maybe my father would be alive. Maybe my mother would be alive. And in many ways, I see myself as a grieving child, looking for my father and hoping maybe this voice, that if I raise it a bit harder, if I'm a bit more in your face with my activism, perhaps I will save another daughter from going through the grief that I unnecessarily went through. And so when I speak, people have called me a voice for the voiceless, and sometimes I have used that tag. I think in very many ways, I'm a voice for my father's daughter. I am my mother's daughter's voice, speaking and saying, if we don't address this inadequacy in the public health system, in the public education system, in the public housing system, then these people will suffer the grief that I endured simply because nobody spoke out around access to health services for my parents. Do I communicate with you?
Yeah, that's absolutely very well put. And this is really the background that I wanted us to start with.
Right.
So to set the stage for people to understand. In fact, I stand corrected, Dr. Nyanzi. All life is political. All life is essentially political. And I wanted us to pivot to that, going to the heart of, I think, some of your prominence in not only Uganda, in Africa and the world, is the visceral reaction that you elicited from the state when you penned a poem that essentially struck right at the center of power, which in Uganda is within the person of the president, and likened him to a pair of buttocks. So I want to bring us to the sense of understanding your creativity and you knowing the social morals of the rather conservative country you live in, which, in addition to the Gambia, also passed the Kill the Gays bill, and in a field that you were working in, understanding full well the ways in which, well, for lack of a better word, it's a patriarchal society. What made you then decide that you will go and touch the ways of advocacy that offends everyone, which is bringing out the sexual images and imagery and emasculating power through your poetry? What inspired you in that kind of direction?
I mean, look, I don't know. I think that a soldier looks for the most effective armor to use, the most effective, the most dangerous, the cheapest sort of ammunition, right? And I think that for me as a writer, humor is one of the things that I appeal to a lot. You said that my images, my language offends everyone.
Well, not everyone. Not everyone. And I wanted to couch that in the general kind of sense where, let me give you an example. Where I was talking to people, for example, leading up to this discussion, I'm going to interview Dr. Nyanzi. And, the first question everybody has been saying to me, how will you manage? Are you going to have a PG discussion? And I say, no, we're going to have a discussion that's open. But that's the caricature in many ways. And that's what I'm saying. In a generally conservative culture, where I was asking, were you aware of the pushback that you would get because of the subjects and topics you are using and the imagery you are using in highlighting your advocacy?
So before you cut me short, I was going to just make a quick point to say that there is a branch of humor called satire, where we speak to powerful people or those who hold power in ways that ridicule and mock them. And often that style is an invitation to those who see the funny side of a really tragic situation, a crisis, to laugh. And often it's the poor, the oppressed, the minorities who will see the sense of humor. Those who are oppressing, the abusers, the misogynists, the capitalists, the extractive exploiters of natural resources, they never get the humor. But the raped woman and the man waiting to be hanged and the young pregnant girl at 9 years old who hasn't been in school for 2 years because the government shut down schools and cannot vaccinate teachers and so schools cannot be open. Those sorts of people laugh painfully with me. And so why do I choose graphic language? Why not? Why not? I think for me that when the ears of the powerful have refused to hear, there are particular languages that have been depoliticized and normalized, and the status quo refuses to hear politeness. And impoliteness is a weapon we lift consciously. It's a heavy weapon. If it's vulgarity or the language of disease or the language of poop and shit and waste and mucus, phlegm and pus, that language of disgust we deploy as a tool to communicate. And I think that when I spoke about, for example, the menstrual hygiene product, when Yoweri Museveni had made a promise in 2016, all those many years ago when he was campaigning to be president, and he reneged on his promise. So many people tried to speak in a language because he had made a million other promises he never fulfilled. When I decided to go to menstrual blood, a taboo subject, and dip my writing pen in the blood of young women who have to miss school because they don't have sanitary pads, and write in the graphic language using the blood of these young women who bleed. And he had promised sanitary pads to their parents, who were very gullible, and they gave him votes hoping he would fulfill his promises, but he reneged and he sent his wife, Mama Janet, to come to Parliament and make rationale about the government lacking resources to fulfill this pledge. When I used menstrual blood to speak truth to power, all of Uganda listened. Mama Janet, who is masquerading and was masquerading at the time as Minister of Education, listened. They heard me. All of Uganda heard me. And when I called for the community to give sanitary pads, maybe a packet, maybe one reusable sanitary pad, maybe a box of sanitary pads that I committed to deliver free of charge to young, poor, rural schoolgirls, Ugandans, Africans, people in the whole world donated towards this project. And it was criminalized, we were targeted. But I think the most effective tool, why I was taken off an aeroplane going to Amsterdam to campaign and also participate in an academic conference on sexual and reproductive health, and I was going to talk about critical menstrual studies. It's because I was writing with menstrual blood. I was writing about menstrual blood. I was taking that which was shaming women from the privacy of their lives and putting it out there just like the president did. And what is interesting for me is nobody criticizes Yoweri Museveni for using menstruation of girls to gain his vote. But they were criticizing Stella Nyanzi and calling me vulgar and shaming me as a mother for talking about menstruation. But I said, not on my watch. He can promise to deliver roads and not deliver hospital beds and not deliver electricity to rural areas and not deliver, but he's not going to get away on my watch if he's promising around menstrual hygiene products and not delivering. And so I think it was effective because you don't talk about menstruation in the presence of men or even women in Uganda. You don't do that. You don't talk about it, but we bleed every day. Well, not every day, once a month, if you're of reproductive age. And I think that this was effective because handling the taboo subject creates a particular attention. And as a communicator, one of the most effective ways of assessing one's ability to communicate is to see the effect. And I think my metaphors are really working well, really working well.
Not to interrupt you, Dr. Nyanzi, because you are right on a very interesting take. Do you worry about the shock value becoming too common? In other words, people becoming inured to say, well, there goes Dr. Nyanzi again. What is she going to say that she hasn't said? Do you worry about that maybe you have shocked the people too much?
No, I'm not worried, because every time I've used that language, I've been really effective. I'm not worried. I mean, look, there's period blood, there's testicles, there's pubic hair, there's a whole variety that one can work with. There's sex styles, and also just to say that although people center very much on my graphic poetry, I write so many other innocent things. I write about motherhood, I write about children, I write for children, I write about love, I write about war, I write a lot, but I think what has tended to strike a chord, particularly in public officials who I criticize and those who hold power, is when I have taken the offensive and written using sexually graphic language. So there must be something there, or when I have used body parts or body processes, right? There's something. Yes.
And when you write and they respond to you with violence, are you expecting that? Is that what you want them to do?
No. Call me naive, call me innocent. No, I'm expecting to be allowed to be a poet. Okay, I'm expecting that poetic license will cover and protect me. I'm expecting an audience. I'm expecting at most laughter. Right, I was surprised when I learned that a whole unit at the criminal, the cyber crimes unit in Uganda was deployed for 6 months on end to just follow my writings online. And I was thinking, gee, how many funders did they deploy? How many personnel? And I was shocked. It wasn't 1 or 2 or 3, it was 18. And so
out of my curiosity, what do their funders say when you are interacting with them? When you go to Luzia, I mean, you've gone to prison so many times. What do the people there say? What do they think? Or they, well, I might be here for an offense, but you are here for a poem. How do people there react to you?
I mean, you're asking about different layers of people. The prison wardresses many times have asked me to write for them, especially when they realize that I take my writing seriously, okay? Public officials have told me to write stuff they cannot write. And they have told me, do not tone yourself down. Do not edit yourself. Of course, there are very many others who have said to me, you are too rude, or you're too impolite, or you have demons in your head and you need exorcism. And there are those who think they can become my mother and point a little girl finger at me and, caution me. But fortunately for me, my mother is dead, and she's dead, I think, partly because of my silence. If I had spoken out, maybe there'd be more ambulances and providing public transport for emergency health situations. And so I think trying to belittle or berate or lecture and ridicule me about the sort of work that I do is not very effective. I think that the people I take more seriously are those who say to me, what were you meaning with this poem? The other people I take seriously are those who say to me, I would never write the way you were writing, but I would like to take on the issues you're writing about, right? And the others who say, I hear you, because we have talked about this for such a long time, but nobody seems to pay attention. But my scandalous sort of writing allows the public media to write about these issues. It kind of reignites the fire that has gone down, and it takes the wax out of the ears of those who should be hearing and making a change. So how do people respond? It depends on who they are. Some people love it, some people hate it. As a writer, I think I'm doing very well. I keep writing no matter what happens, especially when I get punished. Because I served time in prison for a poem I wrote about the president, not the one you mentioned, the one about the pair of buttocks, but the one in which I use metaphors about his mother. Well, I use a mother named Esiteri. His mother was named Esiteri, and I write about the birthing process of Esiteri, and I wish she had killed him in death. And I talk about birthing processes. Every word about birth is there. Every word about a woman's vaginal canal is there. That poem, that the metaphors I use there are really, even I myself sometimes think, wow, girl, you didn't
gone too far.
But I think it wasn't far enough.
Okay.
Had it been far enough, the issues that I was raising would have been talked about, would have been dealt with, because I use these figures of speech, these metaphors, to highlight issues in Uganda where the government has failed. The government continues to fail. And so they focused on the genitalia and forgot about everything else. And that's a bit sad. That's a bit of a disappointment when they focus too much on the symbols that I use and they refuse to get to the place I'm trying to transfer them. That's a bit of a disappointment.
Now, my next question is going to be in two parts. Recently, in a letter to your younger self, I saw you wrote and said, giving advice to your younger self, question everything and be not afraid, write everywhere, do whatever you're going to do and question everything. I want to pair that with incidents of yet another young Ugandan, 23-year-old woman, Ashaba Anna is her name. She wrote a poem herself, right? Saying how she wanted to be the president's side chick. But of course, being very satirical in a way that she wanted to raise these matters of national importance through this desire of wanting to be a sexual figure next to the president. What do you make of that?
Right, so I celebrate Ashana. She is my friend, a personal friend. She's perhaps a generation below me. She just graduated from university. I know her personally. She's going through grief as well. So there are ways in which grief arises, a particular sort of writing out of us. Her father passed on, I think, last year. We'll be doing an anniversary. I think in a moment of grief that the poor, the oppressed, women, members of the opposition in a repressive dictatorship, grief has a way it fine-tunes and clarifies for us very specific questions about a better place, about healing, about recovery. Now, I don't want to say that Anna's satirical writing springs from my own writing, but I want to see echoes of what I do in herself. And I think that part of what I do when I fall into my bed just before I sleep, I think, oh God, thank God I write the way that I do, because I have emboldened a few other younger Ugandans, other Ugandans to write poetically in ways that trouble the spaces they're in. I think how that works for me is that then the state becomes ridiculed every time they take on a woman, a mere woman, writing sexually about the violences and excesses and violations of the state. I was in prison the first time. I was imprisoned and sentenced to 18 months the second time. I never got any audience, but Anna was summoned by the RDC and military men in uniform, and they had an audience with her. And I remember just before she went, I said to her, please be safe, go with a man, but go and see what happens. And they gave her an interesting debate. There was no one debating me. They tried to shut me down. They tried to intimidate me. I was beaten. I was pregnant and beaten to the point of having a miscarriage in prison. And Uganda Human Rights Commission, even when I appealed to them, they did nothing about the torture of a writer in prison, incarcerated not for anything, but because of a poem. And I think that part of the work that my sort of writing has done is to embolden writers to use my style, make their own, but create it out of my template, but also to say to the state, we shall keep talking. And so the state doesn't know what to do with us. I realized that, of course, while Ashana was let go after the engagement with the military security men, a few other writers have been arrested and tortured during interrogation to the point of their testicles being tied with bricks and whippings and waterboarding and that sort of thing. And so I think the terrain is getting a bit easier for others because some of us did the work we had to do. And while many might ridicule me and not understand what I did, I think I'm part of a group of reckless women writers who wrote and allowed others to write. It's like a giving permission to others to do what we've done. And there are people who call themselves Nyanzis. So my surname is Nyanzi, and they add an ST to it. So they are Nyanzis. When I was released from prison, there were all these Nyanzists who wanted to meet me. And I said to them, what is Nyanzism? And what does a Nyanzist do? And I said to them, am I a Nyanzist? Because I don't recognize myself in many of the things they claim that a Nyanzist would do. A Nyanzist writes boldly. Many times I'm writing, I'm very scared and afraid. A Nyanzist is loud. Actually, in real life, I'm very soft-spoken. A Nyanzist will offend you. Many times I'm writing to make people laugh. So this Nyanzism is a cult that is out there. I think more and more with the varieties of other writing styles I have, that Nyanzists find it very difficult to peg me down to one writing style. But Anna and other people like her, some of them claim to have been emboldened by me. Others do not trace what they do to me, but I think I have allowed, I want to believe that I've allowed people to be bold as I can.
Stepping away from that, in general, and this is just a personal observation I'm making, and I think many people are making the same observation. Ugandans are becoming more and more savages in terms of their description of Ugandan life, right? On social media. If you want, among my friends and I, we always joke about how Ugandans will abuse you to no end to make a point. What do you make of that? And this, I think I want to allow Greg to go into the question and answer. But if you could also answer one last question from my end, I'm very interested. What do you read? What are you reading? What kind of stuff do you read?
So do I respond to the Ugandan as savages, or do I respond to the
both? Both, and that will be kind of my last question from my end, and Greg will take us into a Q&A.
Right. So I'm an anthropologist, and Africans have been called barbarians and savages, and I kind of take exception to that sort of description. But again, because you're free to express yourself, I think that what you say is, your observation is based on the sort of savagery we are living. We have been reduced to savages. The savagery of everyday life, especially for those of us who desire freedom. Uganda is like a savage jungle. And what else do you write from if you're drinking savagery and you're drinking brutality and you're drinking, that is what we drink and eat every day. It's a savage place. We need regime change urgently.
And what are you reading? What are you reading? What are the kinds of things you're into?
What am I reading? So there's a young man where's my book? There's a young man who wrote 2 books. His name is Kakwenza Rukirabashaija. He was 2 books that are critical of Yoweri Museveni. He was arrested, he was detained, he was tortured, his house was raided, and the first time he was arrested, it was in light of his first book, a novel he writes called The Greedy Barbarian. He's writing about a fictitious, it's fiction, it's a novel, and he's writing about what has been interpreted to be Yoweri Museveni's origin. Okay? And because of that novel, work of fiction, he was arrested and detained, okay, and tortured, brutally tortured. And then he was released. And upon his release, he wrote a book about the torture. Okay? Detailed, graphic, painful torture. He describes this in another novel that is called The Banana Republic. So I'm reading those 2 books besides each other because Kakwenza Rukirabashaija, this year he won the 10 Internationals Painters Award for courageous writing, and I'm currently reading his 2 books alongside each other. Mm-hmm. But I read a lot. I usually read 3-4 books besides each other, a book of poetry. I read a lot of religious books because the state uses religion, and novels are my favorite. Yeah.
All right. Well, I thank you for taking the time to talk with me. And Greg, I think you have some Q&A questions to follow, so I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Karamaji and Dr. Nyanzi. And I do have some questions, but I have to say I was very reluctant to break in because I think this has just been a fascinating and powerful conversation, and very moving. Hearing about your experiences, Dr. Nyanzi. One question is, given all that you've gone through, would you do some things differently, either because of what you suffered as a result, or because some things you did maybe were not as effective as you'd hoped?
What I would do differently is to heighten. I think I did too little. I think I was too polite. When people say to me, you should self-edit, I think I should self-edit to increase the level of disgust so that people are pushed into action, right? So I feel like sometimes I wasn't effective enough because I put us a little dose of the metaphors that were needed. So rather than undo myself, I think I should have done a bit more of everything I have done, because every time I have written something offensive, I have seen audiences shift in places of power.
I think that's a great lesson. I mean, to everybody, kind of empower your sense of disgust, put it to work in some way. How do you get past the fear?
I don't. So initially, I think I'm writing a bit about innocence and naivety. And I'm an idealist, I'm a dreamer. I believe in an ideal world. And so I think before I actually interfaced with the ugly face of power and experienced the extent of punishment that one can be subjected to because of their writing, I thought, wow, we are free to write and free to express ourselves. I didn't realize that freedom comes at a cost, right? And I learned to fear when the possibility of prison was real. And I became very fearful because people would intimidate and threaten me. And then I went to prison. And a woman of my position going to prison is like the worst thing a woman can do is to go to prison, right? Everything is wiped away, your status, your voice, your education, everything is wiped away from a prisoner of my type in prison, especially because the criminals underrate you. You're in prison for what? You're not even a criminal. And the non-criminals laugh at you because, hey, you thought you were doing something for us, but there you go, you're now a criminal. But having gone to prison, I think the fear of penalties was lifted. I don't fear prison, but the only thing that can happen to me is death. And I think if I die, I will rejoin my parents. I say that all the time. But am I fearful as I write? The fear is ever present because Yoweri Museveni's dictatorship in Uganda is murderous. They are punitive. They are reprisals. And for people such as myself who refuse to be silent, I think that is part of what makes it a fearful adventure to write. I think the hope of the state had been that had I been arrested and imprisoned, I would go silent. Now I come out of prison with a book of novels, of poems, and it's published and it's written in prison, and the poems are smuggled right under the noses of the prison wardresses. I think part of what makes me troublesome is I refuse to be silent. I kept putting up my head and writing one more poem, one more Facebook post. So how do I write against fear? How do I work with the fear? I think part of it is it stimulates me. I don't want my children to be afraid. I want my children to live freely. But I also think that having the worst that can be done to me is to be taken to prison. I don't fear prison. It's a community. It's become one of the communities, as Karamagi said, I've been to prison a few times. So I have work I'm doing there, especially with elderly prisoners and sickly prisoners and lesbians in prison. There's work to be done. So I don't mind going to prison, but there are other sorts of things that can be done. I guess for me, the worst fear is the taking away of my children from me. That's an ever-present threat that I could be punished through the disappearance of my children, the murder of my children. And I think for a mother, that's the real fear. Me, I'm dead. They killed me once, they can't kill me anymore. But I think that fear inspires me. I haven't answered your question, but it inspires me to keep going, perhaps.
Well, we're almost done here, or time's almost up, regrettably. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to kind of take us out on one of your poems.
Which one? Do you know any? I mean, people want me to read some of the more explicit poems, but because I don't only write sexually, I mean, let me write one which I think is not PG. Okay. And it's called Teach the Nation Poetry. I take this seriously because I wouldn't be in prison if our state officials knew poetry. Teach the nation poetry. Deployments of anti-riot police cannot shoot tear gas at rhymes, nor disperse the rhythm of our poems. Teach the nation poetry. Forgotten masses will pack our pain in stanzas that will pierce the core of the tyranny. Raw poems hit harder than your platitudes. Teach the nation poetry. Handcuffs cannot contain the potency of poems. Arrest warrants cannot disappear memorized verse. Poetry can never be detained in jail. Teach the nation poetry. Investigating detectives and crime solvers cannot decipher metaphors, similes, or symbols. Their charge sheets will never make sense. Teach the nation poetry. Write it, recite it, and interpret it. Poems of the oppressed will oppress the oppressor. Poems will transport us to freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Nyanzi, it's been such a pleasure, so informative, so moving, and I think really important for all of us to understand that we have some power. And and we have to work through often the fear that we have to use it and try to make change. And I have to say, I mean, many of the things that you've done, giving the finger to a judge and sitting in their seat when they're late for, a court appointment or whatever, a lot of those things, those of us who live in relatively free societies where we're not going to get punished for doing that stuff, still would not do it just because of the sheer embarrassment. And I think that's something we all should think about, is what people like you are willing to go through to solve our problems and to help people who need help and need justice. So thank you very much. We just really appreciate your being here. And Karamaji, wonderful as always.
Thank you. This was
great
fun.
question.
This was a lot of fun.
Wonderful conversation. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. I want to thank the Qualcomm Foundation, which makes some of our online and live events possible. I want to thank everybody who supports the International Free Expression Project in ways large and small. Please stay in touch. Please visit ifep.io. And please post the YouTube video of this conversation on your social media outlets, if you would. And again, thank you all for being our guest today.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Take care, everybody.